Welcome to this online lecture for Modern Asian History. Today we're going to be talking about Imperial Japan and its impact on China. So let's get to it. Let's take a look at East Asia about 1910. Much of Eastern Asia had been chopped up by various colonial powers. Great Britain had seized India and Burma. France had seized Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Indonesia had been taken by the Netherlands, the Philippines taken by the United States, and various powers had interests in China. As for Korea, as we talked about in class, Japan had made Korea a colony in 1910. But that was only the beginning. Over the next 30 years, Japan would continue to grow more and more aggressive and demanding. Its most prized target was China. Before we get into some of the new material, however, let's recap what we've discussed when it came to Japan and its relationship with China. In 1894 to 95, Japan and China fought the Sino-Japanese War. This was a war, of course, that was won by Japan, stunning much of the world who still saw China as a great power. But Japan, with its modern military and its modern economy, easily destroyed the Chinese army and forced them to the peace table. The peace treaty that came out of the Sino-Japanese War was the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and among other things, Japan forced China to pay large reparations. In other words, China was being asked to pay for the cost of this war. At the same time, Japan was given the Liaodong Peninsula, which is a little peninsula just to the west of Korea. Japan's hold on the Liaodong Peninsula did not last long, however. The triple intervention of Russia, Germany, and France forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula back to China. Of course, as we discussed, the reason behind the triple intervention was that Russia was interested in the Liaodong Peninsula because it was building a railroad through that region. Japan's anger over Russia's interference, I guess, in the triple intervention, as well as its concerns over Russia's interests in the area, led to another war, the Russo-Japanese War, which was fought between 1904 and 1905. This war ended very well for Japan at sea, where they destroyed not one but two Russian fleets. On the ground, however, Japan and Russia fell into a stalemate, as neither was able to dislodge the other from the Liaodong Peninsula. In the Treaty of Portsmouth that ended the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was given control over not the Liaodong Peninsula, but they were given control over the Chinese Eastern Railroad. This was the railroad that was being built by the Russians, and it ran through the Liaodong Peninsula and north into Manchuria. Japan's rights to this railroad were vaguely defined. The Treaty of Portsmouth declared that, in addition to control over the railroad, Japan had the right to keep order along its tracks. Let me repeat that. That's going to become very important later on. The Treaty of Portsmouth decided that, in addition to control over the railroad, Japan was being given the right to keep order along the railroad tracks. Again, remember that later on. To protect that railroad, the Japanese created what became known as the Kwantung Army. And they did this in 1906, and they sent it into the Liaodong Peninsula. Now, if this class had a soundtrack, you would hear ominous music playing at this moment. That's because the Kwantung Army is going to become a real source of trouble over the next 30 years. Japan's interests in China were not restricted to war or to railroads, however. Instead, Japan also encouraged immigration to China. By 1907, the area around the Liaodong Peninsula had about 25,000 Japanese citizens. By 1930, that population was up to 220,000 Japanese citizens. Japan's growing interests in China led it to grow more and more bold in its demands on Chinese sovereignty. For example, in 1915, Japan issued what became known as the 21 Demands. These were demands that Japan was making of the Chinese government, which would limit Chinese control over much of its own territory. Now, why would Japan issue these demands in 1915? What was going on? Well, this is one of those places where it benefits to know what was happening in the world. In 1915, World War I was raging in Europe, meaning that the various European nations were otherwise occupied. Moreover, in China, a revolution had just toppled the emperor and replaced it with a republic. The new government was weak, however, and could not resist Japanese demands. So what were these 21 demands? Well, I'm not going to go into all of them, but some of the more offensive, as far as the Chinese were concerned, one point was the creation of joint Japanese and Chinese police force. Now, what's wrong with that, you might ask? Well, this is Chinese territory. Why are the Japanese keeping law in Chinese territory? That was an affront to Chinese control over this region. At the same time, Japan demanded that it could appoint Chinese government officials to political, economic, and military positions. So once again, Japan is essentially insinuating itself into the Chinese government. Now, just to think about this, this is not unlike what they did in Korea before they ultimately took over that nation. So Japan is repeating this pattern of gaining influence in a foreign country and then making demands upon that nation's sovereignty. Now, the 21 demands really don't go anywhere ultimately because Japan is forced by the West to give up most of these demands. Despite the fact that World War I was raging, Great Britain and France and the other Western nations are growing concerned about Japan's demands in China, and so they forced Japan to give these ideas up. However, they did gain greater rights to build railroads throughout Manchuria. And as we're going to see shortly, the right to build a railroad really has a lot to do with the right to expand one's influence into a region. At the forefront of Japan's imperial efforts was the Kwantung Army. Now, just to review, the Kwantung Army had been created in 1906 after Japan won control over the railroad Russia built in the Liaodong Peninsula. The Kwantung Army was under the command of strong Japanese nationalists. One of these strong Japanese nationalists was a man named Ishiwara Kanji. Now, Ishiwara believed that a final apocalyptic battle with the West was looming in the future, and Japan needed to be ready for this battle. It needed raw materials like coal, iron, and coal to keep its factories humming and its military strong. But where was Japan to get those resources? Well, in China, of course. Specifically, Ishiwara was interested in the conquest of Manchuria in the far northeastern part of the country. Ishiwara argued that it was the most perfect prize for Japan's growing empire. Japan's interests in China, and more specifically in Manchuria, its interest in gaining control over the raw materials of Manchuria, that is, begin and end with the Kwantung Army. The Kwantung Army decided it needed to force the hand of the Chinese. It needed to force the action in Manchuria if it was truly to gain control over this region for Japan. They did this in September of 1931 with what becomes known as the Manchurian Incident. The Manchurian Incident occurs when a bomb is found on the tracks of one of the railroads in Manchuria. The bomb goes off, and though no one was killed, members of the Kwantung Army radioed Tokyo that the Chinese army had bombed the railroad. In response, they attacked the nearest Chinese position and began a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. Of course, later on it was revealed that the Chinese had not laid the bomb. Instead, it had been the Kwantung Army, of course. They had bombed their own railroad in order to make it look like the Chinese had done this. This was merely an excuse to launch a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. Remember earlier how I said that the Kwantung Army, as well as its right to control and keep order on the railroads of China, was going to be a problem? Here is that problem. By March of 1932, Japan's armies had been so successful in Manchuria that Japan decided to detach Manchuria from the rest of China. They declared that Manchuria had seceded from China and declared itself to be an independent nation. This independent nation was now known as Manchukuo. In the full interests of making this plan work, they even named Puyi, the former emperor of all of China, as the new emperor of the country of Manchukuo. Japan's actions in Manchuria created an international outrage. The issue came to a head in 1933 when Japan was forced to defend its aggression in Manchuria against the League of Nations. Japan's ambassador to the League was Matsuoka Yosuke. Matsuoka argued that Japan's invasion of Manchuria was legitimate and necessary. He even argued that China was no longer able to maintain law and order in Manchuria, and so therefore Japan had been forced to do so. He added that China was a weak and backward country where tens of millions of people had died in civil war, tyranny, banditry, famine, and flood. In fact, he makes the argument that China couldn't even protect its own citizens. In contrast, Japan was, quote, a great civilizing nation that has been and always will be the mainstay of peace, order, and progress in the Far East, end quote. Moreover, he made it clear that Japan would not pull its forces out of Manchuria. After all, he argues, would the United States have been willing to withdraw its military from the Panama Canal region? I got to admit, that's a pretty good point. Matsuoka took things farther, however. Let's just read this passage from his speech to the League of Nations. Quote, our present effort to assist Manchukuo to her feet will lead someday, I am confident, to the realization of Japan's desire and duty to help China. I earnestly beg you to deal with us on our terms and give us your confidence. End quote. If the ideas being expressed by Matsuoka sound familiar, it's because they are. They were expressed earlier by Nitobe Inazo, who said, quote, study what we are doing in Korea. Japan is a steward on whom devolves the gigantic task of uplifting the Far East. End quote. The League wasn't fooled, however. They voted to condemn Japan for its invasion of Manchuria. So, how did the Japanese react? The Japanese actually walk out of the League of Nations and ultimately quit this world organization. Japan and its delegates will walk out of the League of Nations and ultimately quit that world organization. Now, let's go back to China and see what's going on there. Thus far, Japan's aggression in China had been restricted to Manchuria. The rest of China remained virtually untouched. That changes in July of 1937 when a Japanese training exercise in Manchuria came under attack near the Marco Polo Bridge. The bridge connected Manchuria to the rest of China, and when the Japanese responded, they crossed the bridge and invaded China proper. This is now all-out war. Their first major target was the city of Shanghai, a city on the coast. Facing incredible resistance, the Japanese hit the Chinese in Shanghai with everything they had. The fighting was brutal. The city was hit by bombers from the air, while tanks rolled through the streets. There is hand-to-hand fighting between buildings. It's truly a brutal battle. Here is a photograph of the Battle of Shanghai. Here is another. And yet another. Ultimately, the Chinese lost 283,000 casualties in Shanghai. The Japanese lost about 40,000. But if you thought that was the worst, I have some bad news for you. The Japanese army next will attack the city of Nanking. The Chinese army, now in shambles, will abandon the city. The Japanese will move in and then commit one of the greatest atrocities of the war. For 6 weeks, the Japanese army rampaged through the city, raping and murdering without conscience. They committed these atrocities on both military personnel and on civilians. Here is a picture of some of that brutality in Nanking.